Good day and welcome to this special edition of Many Things. I'm Father Matt Malone, Editor-in-Chief of American Magazine. For more than 2 weeks now, the country has been rocked, indeed the world has been rocked, by demonstrations against systemic racism and police brutality following the death of George Floyd at the hands of members of the Minneapolis Police Department. And these events are also occurring at a time when we are still reeling from a global pandemic and the economic recession that accompanies it. At a minimum, these events in the last few weeks raise serious questions about racism in this country, about systemic injustice, the performance of law enforcement, and the rule of law. Joining me in a moment is Kerry Kennedy, who is the president of RFK Human Rights. Last week, they released a new video on police brutality that is based on a speech that her late father, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, gave in 1968 called The Mindless Menace of Violence. I thought we would take a look.
Whenever any American's life is taken unnecessarily, whether it is done in the name of the law or in defiance of the law, whenever we do this, then the whole nation is degraded. And yet it goes on and on and on in this country of ours. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of other human beings. Some accuse others of rioting and inciting riots have by their own conduct invited them. This is the violence of institutions, indifference, inaction, and decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger and schools without books. This is the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man amongst other men. We learn at the last to look at our brothers as aliens. For when you teach a man to hate and to fear his brother, when you teach that he is a lesser man because of his color, then you also learn to confront others, not as fellow citizens, but as enemies, to be met not with cooperation, but with conquest, to be subjugated and to be mastered. We learn to share only a common fear, only a common impulse, to meet disagreement with force. But this much is clear: violence breeds violence, repression breeds retaliation, and only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls. We must admit the vanity of our false distinctions and learn to find our own advancement and search for the advancement of all.
Kerry Kennedy, president of RFK Human Rights, thank you very much for joining us.
So great to be with you, Matt.
So why this video now, and why this message? What moved your organization to talk to the world in this way?
You know, this is, as you said, our country is in a moment of crisis where we are, for the first time probably in 52 years, really willing to take a much deeper dive into the 401 years of institutional violence committed against Black people in our country. And the protests went on, and people's reaction to that protest, we kept hearing again and again and again, this people referring to my father, and especially his speech in Indianapolis on the night that Martin Luther King died. And we wanted to have a counter conversation to that, because the next day, the night that Martin Luther King died, 125 cities across our country burned. And the white city fathers across the country said, now we don't owe the Black community anything because they've turned to violence. And my dad wanted to give a speech that said, no, your power derives from a system of anti-Black violence. And that was his Cleveland City Club speech. So we took excerpts from that speech and we superimposed them on photographs that have taken place in our country just over the last few days.
So that speech that your father, Senator Kennedy, gave in Indianapolis, such a powerful extemporaneous address where he really informed the crowd that Dr. King had been killed. And Indianapolis, interestingly enough, was one of the few cities in the U.S. that didn't see widespread riots in the ensuing 48, 72 hours. So the African-American community, in a sense, trusted your father. And I wonder, I think about, as a white person, how do I respond in a way that is generous and open-hearted to these events? What was it, do you think, that caused the community to trust your father in that way?
Well, I think, as you say, they were beautiful words and from the heart. And, he was a presidential candidate and he went into a crowd. The people in the beginning of the crowd, in the front of the crowd, had been waiting for him for several hours. It's long before cell phones, so they hadn't heard the news. But people in the back of the crowd had heard the news on radio, television, etc. And many came equipped with Molotov cocktails and bicycle chains, chair legs. People were ready to riot. And what he said was, for those of you who are angered of the injustice of this act, all I can say is a member of my family was killed by a white man with a gun. So, it's hard to imagine a political leader today standing up in front of a crowd who's, some of whom are ready to riot, and expressing empathy with their anger and their pain and their rage and their instinct or their reaction of violence. I think that my dad's the real lesson of the effectiveness of that speech is not his beautiful words and his empathy in the moment. It's the years and years and years and years of working with Black communities on anti-Black violence across our country. So his years in the Mississippi Delta, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where he started the first community development bank with Black leaders of one of the poorest neighborhoods in our country, his work in Watts, and his work really closely with John Lewis. Incidentally, John Lewis organized that rally in Indianapolis that night. So I think, what are the lessons?
This is John Lewis, who was the real civil rights hero.
The great civil rights hero.
Martin Luther King.
Yes, current member of Congress, freedom rider, etc. But I think that the lesson is talk to people, listen to those, our philosophy is those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So we at RFK Human Rights have worked really closely over the last 5 years with Black-led organizations, a lot of them made up of formerly incarcerated people, to say, what are the issues? What are the solutions? How do we work in community with you? How do we partner with you? How do we listen, not take the lead, but listen to you and follow?
And as you pointed out, for your father, words were not enough. It was important that we take action. And so the next day, when he was speaking again about the mindless menace of violence, as he called it, he talked about that. But it was also, I think you had the sense in that speech that he was hoping that this was a tipping point, that this was a moment when people would finally see what we were facing as a country, and how this affected us in spiritual terms as a country too. Um, as we think and talk about these events today, as we take action today, I think we're also hoping that this is a tipping point. But there were also these moments in the last 30, 40 years that we hoped were tipping points.
Mhm.
Are you hopeful that this is a moment, like that day when your father spoke, that when people will begin to see this in a new way?
I am hopeful, and I'm really glad these protests have not, fizzled out, even though they've been going on for several weeks now. I think this is a time, it's a historic time when we can make real reform, and where cities and political leaders are already doing it. When the Black Lives Matter movement was formed, it was considered radical. And but then you saw Mitt Romney, of all people, saying Black Lives Matter while he was in a march just a couple of days ago. So that shows how mainstream this has become. And when people talk about defund the police, those words mean different things to different groups and different people. But Minneapolis has announced they now have a veto-proof majority of the city council saying that they're going to defund the police and completely remake it over the next couple of years. So I think we see ideas that seemed too much, too far, going too far just a few years ago that are now being mainstreamed, and that's what we have to do.
Right.
Could I just
Yeah, please.
just talk about the spiritual piece of this, though, Matt? Because
yeah, please do.
I think, this is something I'm really struggling with, but I think that because of Corona and our social isolation, we've all been cooped up and wringing our hands, feeling, what can I do about this? And then this whole movement happens because of the murder of a white police officer in Minneapolis of a Black man, and Breonna Taylor, and all these other terrible murders. And it feels like no matter what I do, it's just not enough. And the reason we're all feeling that is, you're right, it's not enough. None of us is enough. This is a moment when all of us have to work together. This has to be a communal exercise in stopping the violence. And it's a moment when you need leadership. We need leadership, and we're not getting it. We're getting the opposite of that from our president. So we feel disconnected, and we feel frustrated, and we feel scared, and we want so desperately to harness this change. And I think, this is a moment when we need to find community and reach out to across our country to find that spiritual breath.
I'm really glad that you brought us back to that, because I remember your father in that speech, The Mindless Menace of Violence, saying that what we need is a cleansing of our souls,
yes,
of our hearts in this country. And that begins by being really radically honest about these issues and our own complicity in them. I just wrote a piece yesterday for America that was a letter to my fellow white Americans, making that very point. I think we really have to start talking honestly with a kind of candor that hurts about these issues. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the part here that we as white people fail to see most often? What is the part that we tend to miss in all of this?
We don't recognize our own privilege because we were born with it and raised with it, and so it's hard to see it because we're in the midst of it. It's like a goldfish in a bowl. He doesn't know that there's an ocean out there because he's just in a bowl. And that's
Right.
we're all in our own fishbowls in a sense. And I think there's so many great videos out there today. There's so many amazing articles being written. There's so many books that we can read and people we can reach out to get a better sense of what it is we need to do. But I'll tell you a great example of this that is challenging for my white friends and also my wealthy friends, which is the idea of defund the police. Defund the police. That scares the hell out of people. And so that's a great way to start a discussion. Why do you need to, what would happen if you did that? If you, why is that necessary? And why do we have so much more policing in the United States than in other countries? Why is it that in many cities, 40% of their budget goes to policing? And exactly what are those policing in the first place anyway? One, violent crime accounts for between 1% and 5% of arrests. So what are they doing with that 95% of the budget? And what would happen if we took that 95% and invested in the schools and in the housing and in the job training and in the trauma and mental health and healthcare of communities of color, and specifically Black communities? What would that look like in the future? So I think that's a way into the conversation that starts to raise a lot of the issues that people need to dig a little bit deeper on.
Because it prompts the question of, what, as you said, what do you mean by that, right? And it seems to me that what you're really talking about is reallocating a lot of these resources to address the causes of this violence. Is that how you understand that phrase?
Yeah, part of it is reallocating towards the community, and also, but it's not just to reallocate to the community. You also have to defund the police themselves because it's an institution that was created out of anti-Black oppression and continues to do that today. Even if unconsciously, that's the reality. There was an article in the Chicago Tribune just a couple of days ago that said of the 35,000 police officers in Chicago, 5,000 of them have 10 or more spots on their record where people have made complaints for using violence. Okay, right. So you can't just say, okay, we'll identify. A friend of mine said, we just identified those 5,000 and we'll get rid of them. And I was like, no. You have a system that allowed 5,000 people, that huge percentage of that police force to be violent consistently. How many complaints didn't even make it into their record? And so you have to change the entire system.
Right, and I think to your point, it invites a conversation, because I think the concern among a lot of folks is, well, what takes its place? Are we talking about not having any police at all? How will we keep that part of the community that needs to remain safe? How will we do that?
Exactly. So those are the questions we should be grappling with. Absolutely.
Kerry Kennedy is the president of RFK Human Rights, and you can find out about their work at rfkhumanrights.org. Kerry, thank you so much for being with us, and best of luck in your work.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you so much. Take care.
These are issues, of course, that we continue to cover at America Magazine, providing news, analysis, and spiritual resources. This is an issue, race, that America Magazine hasn't always gotten right, but we have had a concern about since really our founding. And throughout our archives, there is a wealth of material charting this country's long struggle to come to terms with what is, I think, its original sin, as many people have said quite accurately. Right now, at AmericanMagazine.org, you can see what is being said at the moment and our coverage of events as they unfold. So our editors put out an editorial on Friday that talks about, well, the title of it is "To Fight Racism, Catholics Must Hunger for Justice as We Do for the Eucharist." Now that, of course, was not in any way to diminish the centrality of the Eucharist to our life. But what the editors are talking about there is that during these days of the epidemic, when we've been quarantined and not able to gather as a liturgical community, I think we have all become aware of how much we desire union with the Lord in the Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament. And what the editors are saying is, we have to cultivate a same kind of longing, a same kind of desire in our hearts for justice. And that our neighbors, our fellow citizens, are crying out for justice and for understanding. And it begins, of course, with our own conversion, that own desire for justice that is heartfelt, not just a mental exercise, as Kerry Kennedy was saying. There is a spiritual dimension to this problem that we have to be mindful of. So I encourage you to check that out. We also have a story on our webpage that really captures, I think, a great cross section of the reaction among Catholic leaders and activists to these issues. And we also have spiritual resources, a prayer, several prayers actually, and spiritual reflections on these issues. And I just authored a piece yesterday that we released at AmericanMagazine.org that is titled "An Open Letter to My Fellow White Americans." And it's my modest attempt to get us as white folks to talk about this stuff honestly and with candor, that kind of candor that can sometimes hurt. I want to mention that this week I will also be talking to Bishop Roy Campbell, who is an auxiliary bishop in Washington, D.C. He is an African American, and he is the head of the National Black Catholic Congress. I very much look forward to that conversation, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. There is no shortage of things to talk about these days, but this clearly has to be at the top of the list. If this really is to be a tipping point, a moment when things begin to change. There's some, of course, doubt about that, but as always, we live in hope, as Robert F. Kennedy did. So please follow us on YouTube for all of our videos, and check out our content at www.americanmagazine.org. Be sure to follow us on social media, and check your social media for updates about the regular edition of this program and special editions to talking about the issues we're confronting at this hour in the life of our church and in our country. Thank you for watching. Have a great day, and God bless you.